Good morning, students. Hope you are safe and well. This lecture is for April the 7th. When we left off, we were discussing the destruction of the city of Jerusalem. And of course, let's realize that the destruction of the temple and the desecration of the temple ground was something that significantly changed Judaism forever. Their sacrificial system ended because there was no place to go to offer the sacrifices to God. And so, with the shift away from the priesthood, the most influential people in Judaism became the rabbis. Now, many of the rabbis or teachers would get together. And so, following the destruction of Jerusalem, the leadership moved to the region of Galilee. And during the 2nd century, Judaism worked through the rabbis to put together a legal commentary. It was an attempt to summarize the mass of custom, concept, legislation of the Jews. There was no Jewish nation. There was actually no hope of rebuilding the temple or reestablishing the priesthood. So all that was left was this summarization of the law in a work called the Mishnah. Now, there will be an attempted rebellion in 135. Simon Bar Kokhba will lead this to try to retake Jerusalem, and as the Jewish rebellion beginning in 66 had failed, this one miserably failed as well. So, through the Mishnah, the rabbis tried to interpret what the Torah really meant by keeping the Sabbath. And so they tried to develop interpretations and secondary laws that would make the Sabbath day a day of worship and joy. We have no temple. So Jewish worship shifts from the temple worship solely relying now on the synagogue and the family. So according to the Mishnah, the Sabbath was to be a happy day. The best food was to be served, the best clothes were to be worn, and the people were to rally together as a family. Well, following the completion of the Mishnah, Jewish leadership will have to shift, especially after the Bar Kokhba rebellion, from Galilee, and it will actually go to Babylon. Wow, where they were held captive for 70 years. How interesting history can be sometimes. And basically, the Talmud will be a commentary on the Mishnah. So they will come up with a huge set of traditions that will bind Judaism from that time forward. All right. During the 1st century, and we'll talk about this more in just a little bit, of course, we will have the rise of Christianity. And though it makes some people very uncomfortable, yes, Jesus Christ was a Jew. He was raised in the Jewish faith. He attended services, festivals, the feasts at the great temple. And so he was a part of that. And early on, as Christianity was established, it in Judaism, to the Romans at least, looked like, well, just another sect of Judaism has arisen. And for a time, Christians could worship with the Jews, but that quickly began to change. We read in the biblical book of Acts that people in Jerusalem and then other places began to persecute Christians, and this will be very much a part of Christian tradition for years to come. And so ultimately, by the time of the destruction of the temple in Jerusalem, Christianity and Judaism had totally, completely broken from one another. And Christianity had shifted heavily from trying to win Jews to become followers of Jesus to the emphasis upon Gentiles becoming followers of Jesus. And so these Talmuds then became oral law for the Jewish people. And this will guide them toward the Middle Ages. Well, following the death of Muhammad, Islam somewhat looked at Judaism as being a people of the book. Of course, Muslims gave lip service to the scriptures. You will find people like Noah, Abraham, Moses, even some of the prophets, even Jesus himself being mentioned in the Quran. But as time went on, the Muslims turned more and more against the Jews. And so the relationships will become worse and worse. And of course, the relationship between Jews and most Muslims today is totally horrific. And there are so-called reasons for that. When the modern state of Israel was formed in 47-48, of course, some Palestinians were displaced. As a result of that, several Arab nations declared war on Israel, and Israel ultimately won that war. And of course, many more Palestinians wound up being displaced. Well, the Arab world howled about that, but the Arab world did nothing about that. Now, what I mean is this is so horrible. These people have been displaced, and not one Arab state offered those Palestinians a place to come and live with them. So I find that rather hypocritical, to say the least, that they're still hollering about that today. And that's one of the reasons many of your Arab states are so anti-Jewish. It's going all the way back to 1947, 1948. And yet again, I emphasize, they, other than some of the nations teaming together to fight Israel, and they will do that several times, other than that, they've done nothing for the Palestinians. So all of these wars, if anything, have made things worse for the Palestinians than better. But yet, that is their major argument as to why they hate the modern state of Israel so badly. Well, as we go into the Middle Ages, history of the Jews is quite unstable. Of course, following the destruction of Jerusalem, those that weren't killed were scattered throughout the Roman Empire. A lot of them wound up in Spain. Well, ultimately, a good portion of Spain will actually be conquered by the Muslims. They'll be called the Moors there. And Judaism will be tolerated until after the Reconquest and the final unity of Spain with Ferdinand and Isabella. And with them, they had two problems: what to do with the rest of the Arabs, what to do with the Jews. And so they came up with a simple solution for both. Either you convert to Catholicism, you leave the country now, or you die. And those were the three choices offered. Now, obviously, most of your Moors are going to wind up leaving, as did most of the Jews. So the Jews will go to France. Well, the French will turn around and do the very same thing. And so they'll move toward Austria and Hungary. Some of them will wind up in Eastern Europe and Poland and all the way to the western fringes of Russia. Well, during the Middle Ages, Jews were quite successful business-wise, and that always made people suspicious of them and in many ways jealous of them. And the Jews began to more and more become scapegoats. During the bubonic plague, the Black Death, Jews were originally blamed for that, for having poisoned the water wells. Well, obviously, eventually it was discovered that it was fleas from the black rats, but still, we blame the Jews. During the Crusades, the Jews will be attacked several times on the way to relieve the Holy Land from the Arab conquests. And yet, once again, anti-Semitism is alive, well, and strong. Now, I'm making this point for a very important reason. Hitler wasn't the first by any stretch of the imagination. Hitler just seemed to be picking up on a tradition and a way of life in Europe that had existed for years and years to come. And of course, there will be several scientific things that I'll talk about that will actually contribute to Hitler's madness, and that's the only way he can be described, as to what he did to the Jews. So let's say that the Jews throughout the years have been mistreated and mistrusted. In fact, under Charlemagne, which was the Carolingian epoch in what ultimately became France, the Jewish status did improve a little bit because Charlemagne would recognize that Jesus was a Jew. Under Louis the Pious, they probably enjoyed status as they had never enjoyed before. But again, as I say, that was short-lived. And by the time the Crusades roll around, 150 years after Louis the Pious, it's all over. Jews are suffering once again. And so their life had been very, very unstable, very mistreated. By the end of the Middle Ages, the Jewish Babylonian community had collapsed, and so by the end of the Middle Ages, the image of the Jews had deteriorated, and literally the word Jewish came to be associated with the word diabolical, and the two words almost become synonymous. So, Poland, Eastern Europe, a lot of Jews there. And so, as we come to the more modern times, of course, Hitler will do two things. Number one, he'll create a German national myth. Now, let me say, a myth believed is just as powerful as truth. And so he sells the German people on the fact that they are a superior super race, Then, of course, he has to create a scapegoat. And this is where science works in. If you recall, one of the basic principles of Darwinism is the idea of survival of the fittest. Well, Hitler defines the German people as the fittest. And so, as he begins to look around at other peoples, and during the late 19th century, we have a scientific field of study called eugenics. Eugenics was literally scientific racism. People were characterized by the shape of their skull, the color of their skin, and of course we had a hierarchy of races. And Africans, Jews, some Eastern Europeans were all put toward the bottom of that ladder. And so with the myth that we are a superior people, Hitler then turned around and figured out, okay, we'll blame the Jews for the reason we lost World War I. And so we have a myth to charge the people up. We have a scapegoat to beat up. And so indirectly, Darwinism actually led to the Holocaust. And yes, the Holocaust really did take place. Hitler wanted to exterminate Europe of Judaism. And he killed 6 million Jews in the process. I might add, he killed 7 million others. He killed gypsies. He killed those that were not considered physically able to be a part of that so-called superior society. He killed Catholics. He killed Protestants. He killed anyone that spoke against him, including having his own officers executed if they didn't perform their duties up to what he thought they should do. So this is just exactly what kind of a diabolical mad person Hitler really, really was. And so, as a result, some of the survivors of the Holocaust will be allowed to go back toward Palestine, which at that time the British had control of, and they will be allowed to start the modern state of Israel. Interestingly enough, the first 2 nations to acknowledge this modern state, and it was acknowledged by the United Nations, will be the United States and Great Britain. The third nation just totally shocked me, but it will be the Soviet Union. So Israel will become a modern state, and it is today. I will say something about the modern state of Israel. You do not want to mess around with them. The Arabs have fought several wars since 1948 with them, and every time the result is always the same. The Israelis wind up winning. They have a very powerful military. Every young person in Israel has compulsory military service. And I mean every, unless there are some very special exceptions. So, in some shape, form, or fashion, all Israelis know how to fight if they need to. And so, the modern state of Israel is an ally of the United States. It is a force to be reckoned with. There have been some peace efforts. Egypt has made a sort of kind of peace with Israel. Saudi Arabia is beginning to open up, and there are actually flights from Tel Aviv, which is where the main airport is in Israel, into Saudi Arabia and back and forth, and they are doing some trading. So there are some Arab nations who have moderated in their feelings toward Israel in the last few years. Of course, part of that may be they are actually lining up for what may be a struggle within there. And so you've got Arab nations figuring, hey, I'd rather have Israel on my side than on the other side if a war does break out. Okay, so let's talk about Judaism as it exists today. Your textbook makes an interesting point that New York City has the largest concentration of Jews anywhere in the world. That includes the modern state of Israel. So, a huge number of Jews in New York City. Now, within Judaism, there are three major groups. You have the Orthodox, which is the largest group, and of course, they, to the best of their ability, try to preserve traditional Jewish culture and religion. You have Reform Judaism, which is popular mainly in the U.S. and Europe, and it more emphasizes the universality of traditional Jewish values and so on. And then the third branch is the Conservative Judaism, which is deeply rooted in the rabbinical tradition, but it would kind of be in between, if you will, the Orthodox and the Reformed branches of Judaism. So, as we begin to think about Judaism, we need to realize that because of its history, because of what has taken place and so on, it is a culture, it is a historical people, it is laws, it is arts, it is a religion. It is all of these things, and yet it can be each one of these things separately. So as we think about Jerusalem and Israel today, how do they celebrate? Of course, the Sabbath is their focal point. In the Sabbath, of course, you come together, you light candles. The woman of the house plays a very important role in the Sabbath meal. And then conservative and Orthodox Jews will attend a synagogue on Saturday morning. Now, remember what I said earlier. For the Jews, the day begins at 6 p.m., not midnight. Midnight is Roman time. Jewish time was 6 p.m. in the evening. Okay, at this time of year, we always have what is called Passover. It is an 8-day feast. Of course, it commemorates the deliverance of Israel from slavery in Egypt. It defines Jewish history, really. It is the beginning point of Jewish history. To Jewish history, it's what the American Revolution was to the United States. And, of course, to them, it is a celebration of God acted in history. And it is always a springtime celebration. All right, they also have what is called the Feast of Weeks. This comes after. It is called Pentecost in the New Testament, and it is the first grain harvest. In other words, the first fruits. And this again would be a springtime celebration to honor the blessings God has brought upon their people. They have New Year, which generally is September, October, and that culminates in the Day of Atonement. Now, in biblical times, the Day of Atonement involved sacrifices and so on. Today, the Day of Atonement is to be spent in the synagogue where prayers are offered for forgiveness of sins. But the Day of Atonement in biblical times was a most important thing to them. Then the Feast of Tabernacles, which comes later in the year, is the harvest feast. And realize once the Jews got to the land of Canaan, they were an agricultural people. An additional 2 feasts were added. These were the 3 biblical feasts. During the intertestamental period, a Seleucid king desecrated the temple. The Jews actually went to war against the Seleucids, won their independence, rededicated the temple, and when they relit the menorahs after cleansing the temple completely, this became the Feast of Dedication. Now, this normally happens in December near our Christmas time. And so at this, the Jews tend to give gifts to one another, just as we tend to do at Christmas time. And then the other feast came about during the days of Esther, who was married to Xerxes, the king of Persia. And this was a feast where a plot was uncovered to kill Jews in the Persian Empire. And that plot was overthrown. And so Esther becomes a hero. And the people were giving thanks because they were spared being destroyed by their enemies in Persia. A couple of other things that come on. A young man will technically become a man at 13, and he will go through what's called a bar mitzvah. At that time, he will be able to read Hebrew scriptures, he will be able to say prayers, and so on. And a modern invitation to that has been the bat mitzvah, which is for young women. And they begin to assume a responsibility as a part of being the Jewish community. So, why is what is called the Western Wall, by some the Wailing Wall, so very important to the Jewish people? This was actually not a part of the temple itself. It was a retaining wall for field dirt that Herod the Great brought in as he began his expansion of the Jewish temple. So, to the Jews, it is the closest thing to being able to get near where their temple was located. Now, if you go to Jerusalem today and you go to what's called the Dome of the Rock, which is a Muslim mosque which was built on the temple site, depending on who's at the doorway, you might get some interesting answers. When my wife and I went, I was actually going to try to take a picture of it, looking from the east backwards, because east would have been where the front of the temple would have been facing. And I asked the guy if this was the eastern side and would have been the front of the temple, and he goes into a tirade that no, the temple was never there. That was only Jewish propaganda. And, I just turned around and walked off from the guy. But the temple was located there. Jews generally are not allowed on the Temple Mount anymore. And of course, to get up there, you have to go through security just like you would in an airport. It is very, very closely guarded because it is always feared, and has been for generations, that if some kind of rebellion takes place, it's going to revolve around the temple complex in some shape, form, or fashion. Okay, what are some basic beliefs that I could say are universal to Judaism? Okay, the bottom line, most important, unwavering belief is there is one universal, eternal God who is creator. Now, the Jews, during the latter period of the kings, dallied in idolatry quite a bit. And of course, idolatry will be the reason for the fall both of Israel and of Judah. But after the Babylonian captivity, they were pretty much cured of that. That wasn't a prevalent problem among Judaism after those times. And so, one God. He is eternal. He does act in history. He was the creator, and so on. Now, some Jews take the entire Hebrew Bible. Some Jews take only what is called the Torah, the law, the first 5 books. Some look at it as inspired. Some look at it as being a human product. So they struggle with some of the same things there that some of the Christian groups struggle with as well. Okay, number 2, that individuals are born with propensities, I like that word, to be either good or evil, and that they must learn to master the evil in their lives. And something quite different from what we have noted in most of our world religions so far, they believe in a resurrection of the dead and the immortality of the human soul. And though the Hebrew Bible doesn't say a whole lot about it, Jews do believe in heaven and in hell. They have a concept of an evil being known as Satan, and we read about him in Scripture. He will introduce sin into the world if you read the book of Job, and many of you will read that in literature under Professor Jarrett. You will find out quite a bit about him, the adversary, the enemy, the opponent. And so what Satan wants, obviously, is to accentuate that propensity toward evil. What God would want would be quite differently. God would want you to overcome that and be the kind of person that God himself would have you to be. Okay, so this pretty much covers Judaism for us. Now, as we move on, Christianity is the largest religion in the world. Now, when I speak of it in that reference, I mean in all of its aspects. Catholicism, Orthodoxy, Protestantism, and we'll talk about these divisions later on. Now, what is unique about Christianity? What are some basic points? Number 1, Christians believe in the uniqueness of Jesus of Nazareth. That in some way, and there's some differences here, but in some way, he provided for the redemption of humanity by his death, and that he was resurrected from the dead. So 3 basic importance. Jesus was a unique person while he was here on earth. That he provided for atonement for sin, and that he was raised from the dead. So These are three very important principles of Christianity. All right, let's talk about the world into which Christianity was born. It was a Roman world. Rome basically owned all the territory around the Mediterranean. In fact, the Mediterranean was actually called a Roman Sea. Now, Rome ruled with an iron hand. They didn't like rebellion. They didn't like disturbances. They didn't like problems of any kind. They took their civilization wherever they conquered. They had their administrators. They built their cities and roads to link them together. In fact, there was a phrase in the ancient world that all roads led to Rome. Communication was extended further and traveled safer than it had ever been before. So when Christian missionaries finally come on the scene, they were able to travel through the Roman Empire basically like we're able to travel across the United States, which was a very unique thing for the world. Rome also gave the world a universal language. Now, early on in the first century, when Christianity is planted, that language is Greek. It will later evolve to Latin. But early on, it was Greek. So in the Roman world, wherever you went, there were going to be people who spoke Greek, and you were going to be able to communicate with them. Now, quite honestly, in our world today, this has pretty much become English. Pretty much everywhere you travel now, you're going to hear some English. That hasn't always been true, but it is true today. Okay, as I say, Pax Romana, Roman peace. That was an imperative established by Augustus, the first truly powerful emperor of the Roman Empire. And every emperor that followed, in his own way, tried to maintain that Roman peace as best he possibly could. Now, Rome had no official religion. Polytheism was tolerated, and there were probably somewhere around 1,120 deities in the Roman pantheon. The closest thing that will happen to a universal worship is that during the reign of Augustus, people will start offering worship to him. And of course, this will become a central act of patriotism to the Roman Empire. Once a year, everybody was called upon to offer incense to the emperor. Now, the bad thing about that is Jews are not going to do it. They were exempt. But Christians were not going to do it. And sadly, because Christians are going to be mainly Gentiles, this is going to be a point of persecution for them because they are considered unpatriotic. Of course, all kinds of horrible rumors are going to go out about Christians. Christians are actually going to be accused of being cannibals, that during the Lord's Supper, during communion, the Eucharist, as it was called, that they are eating the flesh of children and drinking their blood. Of course, when you want to stir people up to action and cause them to act unreasonably, you say unreasonable lies about another people, and that is what is going to go on to inflame persecutions against Christians. So, this is the world into which Jesus Christ was born. Now, in Judea, which at the time of Jesus' birth was actually part of the Roman province of Syria, there was a pseudo-king by the name of Herod the Great. One of the most paranoid human beings that has ever lived. Killed his own family. But boy, you talk about somebody that could roll with the political punches. It was Herod the Great. When Julius Caesar was the lead guy, Herod was 100% for Julius Caesar. When Caesar was murdered, Herod backed Mark Antony, who was going around rounding up the conspirators against Caesar. And when Herod figured out that Caesar had adopted Octavian to be his son and successor, he suddenly became a total Octavian fan. And so, boy, he could roll with the political punches and kept himself in power a long time. Now, actually, when he died, the Jews celebrated. Oh, they had a big party because this guy was gone. But Herod did a lot of building projects. And one of his building projects was to take the temple that had been rebuilt during the time of Zerubbabel after the Babylonian captivity, and he greatly expanded it. He hoped this would make him more popular with the Jews. He actually did it simply to show off. He built the city of Caesarea. Now, Caesarea was unique in that he went out into the harbor and built a protective wall, so when the ships were in the harbor at Caesarea, they would be protected from winter storms on the Mediterranean. And if you go to Caesarea today, to the ruins there, you can actually look out into the harbor and still see remnants of this wall that was built there. So he was very much trying on one hand to pacify, I will say, the Jews, and on the other hand, impress the Romans. But no doubt about it, Herod had concern for one person and one person alone, and that was Herod. All he cared about was himself. He was a Herod guy. And so he will be in charge when Jesus is born. Well, as I said, he's a very paranoid guy. And when some people start showing up and saying, we have heard the new king of the Jews has been born, Herod's naturally concerned about this. And so, was it possible that the massacre of babies took place in the city of Bethlehem? By all means. Herod killed members of his own family. So, he wouldn't hesitate to kill babies that he had no idea who they were, who their parents were, or anything else. So his cruelty was unmatched, and that would have fit right within his cruelty. Of course, Jesus was spared, spent a little time in Egypt to escape from Herod, and then he will come back. Now, Jesus grew up in the northern region of Israel of that day and time, in a region called Galilee. And growing up there, his father is characterized, his earthly father at least, as being a carpenter. That's probably the trade Jesus learned. Now, Herod had a couple of building projects going on near Nazareth where Jesus grew up, and so it is very possible that Joseph, and maybe even Jesus as a young man, had part in some of these building projects that were taking place. Okay, we have 4 books of biography. in what is called the New Testament that tell us about Jesus. Now, some people complain, well, there's not a whole lot of secular material about Jesus. So, did he really exist? Well, a Roman historian named Tacitus and a Jewish historian named Josephus both write some about Jesus and tell us that he actually did exist. But the information that we have on Jesus, especially his early life, are in these 4 books that are generally called Gospels. That's a word that actually just simply means good news. And 2 of them go back and tell us about his birth and early life. Now, some people say, well, Matthew and Luke contradict each other. No, they don't. Matthew and Luke cover different aspects of the birth narrative of Jesus. And when you put the 2 together, then is when you get a more total picture. So rather than a contradiction, what we really have is a harmony between the 2. But both writers assert that Jesus was born of a virgin, a woman who had had no sexual contact in her life. And for, I would say, the majority of Christians, this becomes a 4th important aspect about the life of Jesus Christ. Joseph was simply a stepdad, an earthly father. And according to the scriptures, Jesus Christ was divinely born, the Son of God. And that's what these Gospels assert. Now, I will say something about the Gospel of Luke. Those of you that have had me for history, you know I'm kind of a chronological guy. I like to start at the beginning and go through and tell the historical narrative. Well, Luke becomes my gospel because of that, because Luke is the narrative gospel. But it's interesting that some secular historians, professional historians, people that know the craft of writing history, and there is a true craft to being able to do that, as they examine the Gospel of Luke, many of them have concluded that Luke was one of the finest historians that has ever lived. That today, Luke would be considered a scholar. He would be on the lectureship circuit, lecturing about history and how to write history and how to present history and so on. Luke would have been their champion. And so I find it very interesting that people that are not necessarily opposed to Christianity, but on the other hand, not necessarily huge supporters of Christianity, will look at the Gospel of Luke and the book of Acts that he also wrote and talk about what great scholarship and exactness is brought out in these books. Now, I bring this point up for a very important reason. I think this helps us be able to better accept what the Gospels have to say. Personal point. Of course, I am a trained historian. One of the things I have been trained to be is skeptical. You read something and you say, okay, really? That's supposed to be fact? You know, you give me document, you give me evidence, you give me reason to accept this as being a reasonable account of something, and then I will accept it, but not before. I have no problem with my skeptical training in accepting the entire Bible, Genesis to Revelation, as being the inspired Word of God. It is a book beyond comparison. A little phrase for you. Man could not have written the Bible if he would, and would not have written it if he could. Now, what that simply means is, from Genesis to Revelation, there is no contradiction. Now, in my studies of history, I've read a lot of books. And I have read authors contradict themselves within a single book they're writing. I've read authors contradict themselves in multiple books they have written. But there's no contradiction in the Bible. Human beings could not have done this. And yet, on the other hand, the Bible doesn't always paint a rosy, beautiful picture of some of the great heroes. Noah, who saved humanity, got drunk. Abraham, the great man of faith, lied. Moses had a temper. He killed a man in anger, and then later lost his temper and struck a rock instead of speaking to it. David, a man that is said at one time to be a man after God's own heart, committed adultery and had a man murdered to cover up his act of adultery. Solomon, the wisest man that ever lived, quite honestly was the wisest fool that ever lived, married foreign women and let them take his heart away from God. And by the way, Solomon is a great example of one of the reasons I believe the Bible. He wrote the book of Proverbs. Proverbs has a lot of wonderful advice in it. Great book for young people, by the way. Strongly recommend it to you. But of the things said in the book of Proverbs, there are a lot of things that Solomon said do that he didn't do. He definitely didn't practice what he preached. But that doesn't mean what he said do was invalid. It's just he couldn't live up and measure up to what he was writing about even during his own lifetime. Okay, so why? Why do I believe so strongly that Jesus is who Scripture claims him to be? Well, number one, in history, many things you accept are because reliable eyewitnesses saw those things and wrote about them. I believe Alexander the Great existed. Never met the guy, but I believe he existed because reliable historians tell me he did. Same thing of George Washington. Same thing of General Patton from World War II. Lots of people I believe in that I never met, but I believe in them because of reliable witnesses. Well, Jesus will have 12 men he will call apostles. 11 will be faithful to him, and they will give their lives for the teaching of Jesus. Now, if Jesus had lied to them for 3 to 3.5 years, I imagine most of them would have been sorry we followed a false teacher and gone back to their old ways of life. But I don't believe 11 men would die for a lie, for myth. But those men will. Okay, we've already noted historical writers. Look at the very existence of Christianity today and its impact upon the world through the years. All of these things testify that there is really something to this. But then another thing. About 350 times in the Hebrew Scriptures, there are predictions made about the coming of a Messiah. And all of these, without exception, are fulfilled in the life of Jesus Christ. Now, students, that's impossible. Humanly. I mean, with the technology we've got today, that we can, kind of bend things and whatever else, we could not force those 350 prophecies into fulfillment. But all of them were fulfilled in Jesus Christ. And to me, this is evidence that is overwhelming, undeniable, that what both the Hebrew and Christian, if you want to put it that way, scriptures say about Jesus is true. One amazing story. One amazing life. An individual that probably didn't travel more than 90 miles in distance in his entire life, and yet he has impacted the entire world. Pretty amazing life indeed. But as a youth, a pretty normal Jewish young man's life. Well, as we proceed, Mark actually begins his gospel with a man named John the Immerser. He's a relative of Jesus, and we find him in the Jordan River doing something unique. He's baptizing people. Now, the Jews had certain ceremonial washings, but you always did these yourselves. But here's John out in a river actually performing the act on people, and he's telling them to repent and to believe in the one who is going to follow him. And ultimately, Jesus will actually come to John and be baptized by him. And from then on, John will identify Jesus as the Lamb of God who takes away the sins of the world. Hence the idea of that sacrifice that we were talking about. So, Jesus will be baptized. The scriptures tell us he will go one-on-one for about 40 days with Satan and overcome him in every way. Several New Testament writers tell us that Jesus was without sin. That's important. If he's going to be the sacrifice for sin, it's obvious that he can't be a person laden with sin like everyone else. And so he will return from this period of temptation, and he will start a preaching ministry that will, according to the Gospel of John, fit into about a 3.5 year period. And he's going to be traveling between Galilee and Judea, and he's going to be preaching a very unique message that forgiveness of sins is coming and that God expects people to live a special lifestyle indeed. Now, all of the Gospels, all 4 accounts, present the fact that Jesus spent his time teaching and healing. He performed all kinds of miracles. Fed multitudes, walked on water, healed the sick, made the lame to walk, the blind to see, actually raised people from the dead. And of course, the liberals throw their hands up and oh, no. All of these things couldn't happen. But eyewitnesses saw all of these things. Eyewitnesses testified to all of these things. These weren't cheap magicians' tricks. These were things that Jesus was able to do by the power of God. In fact, the first time the gospel is preached after the resurrection of Jesus from the dead as Peter is up speaking, he makes the point, Jesus of Nazareth, a man attested to you by miracles and wonders and signs, which God did among you by him. So he calls attention to that audience. You saw what Jesus did. You know what he did. And of course, that day, many people will respond to his message and become Christians. So, a couple of things that are very important here before we take a break till the next class. Jesus' message is really totally different from the world. The world message basically was somebody do something to you, you get even with them in every way you possibly can. Jesus teaches a new message. He teaches you treat others the way you want to be treated. In fact, students, if you have to break Jesus' message down to one word, and one word only, that one word would be the word love. Love God with all your heart, mind, body, and soul. Love your neighbor as yourself. Love your enemy. These are the teachings of Jesus. Not all the teachings of Jesus are easy. Some of them call on a lot of self-sacrifice within individuals to be able to be exactly what Jesus would have them to be. So as we think about Jesus' teaching, his main teaching device was a parable. That means to lay beside. And what a parable was basically a short, easily recognized story that would take physical things and illustrate spiritual things. And so he made his lessons timely. He made his lessons appealing. He used agriculture. He used fishing. He used all kinds of things, building and so on, to illustrate spiritual points and try to get people to be able to understand the importance of the great message. His language undoubtedly used an invitational style instead of telling people what to do. His language, as recorded in the Gospels, is simple, it's concentrated, and it really points out what is important in life. But maybe the most important aspect that we need to consider at this point is he lived what he preached. It wasn't like Solomon that wrote a book and basically said, do what I say do, not what I do. When Jesus called upon people to live a certain way, he lived that way. So he was a man of what he preached. Now, your textbook says, difficult to find a central theme. Of course, I would kind of break everything down into the concept of love. But obviously, another central theme is that human beings, through him, will be able to be saved from their sins, and they will have a hope of eternal life. Now let's think what the average Roman thought. When you die, you go float around in a river with a bunch of dead people. Wow. That's really inviting. You really want to die, don't you? You really look forward to that. But then Jesus comes along and he starts telling people there is a place that he will personally prepare for them to come and spend eternity with him. And so we see in Jesus Christ a most unique individual with a new teaching that is different from anything we have covered so far this semester. Now, if you go through Jesus' teaching, yeah, you can see some hints of some of these universal values that come out of all of the religions we have covered. But Jesus takes all of these a great step forward. Not simply what you do, but it's what you do that arises from within you. So when we come back on Thursday, we'll pick up on these ideas and look at some more teachings of Jesus, his life, and what he sought to do, and then go into the establishment of Christianity and some of the things that have taken place in it. Students, be safe. Have a good day.